Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for all of you for joining us this evening. My name is Amanda Davison-Young. I'm the CEO of The Tablet, and I'm delighted this evening to have Joanna Moorhead with us, who's The Tablet's art editor, and she's going to be talking to our distinguished guests about presenting the imagery and message of St Francis of Assisi. If you've got any questions as we're going through this webinar, then please just put them in the chat box and we'll feed them through to the panel. And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Joanna. Many thanks. You're just on mute, Joanna.
Can you hear me? Is it working? Sorry about that. Welcome to everybody. It's really great to see so many friends of the tablet and readers to have you with us this evening. And I'm really excited to share some information and some of the story of St Francis of Assisi. Let me introduce our guests for this evening. We've got Father Alban McCoy, who's a Franciscan priest, and he's Emeritus Dean of St Edmund's College, Cambridge, and he's my colleague at the Tablet. He's a member of the Tablet editorial team. And also with us is Gabriele Finaldi, who's the director of the National Gallery here in London. He's also former deputy director of the Prado and a distinguished figure in the art world, obviously. And the kind of occasion for our webinar this evening is that we're on the eve of a major exhibition opening at the National Gallery next week, which is celebrating the art around St Francis of Assisi. And we also, in fact, have, by chance, the Tablet also has a pilgrimage going to Assisi later this year, led by Alban. So there are plenty of reasons to be celebrating Assisi right now. I thought it might be a good idea to start off if I just sort of give the bare bones of Francis's life, because we're going to talk in a lot more detail about who this man from Assisi was and why he matters. So I don't want to give the whole story away, but just to give you the kind of, you know, the ballpark. So Francis of Assisi was born around 1181 in Assisi in Umbria in Italy. He was born into a well-to-do family, and by all accounts, he was a very accomplished young man. He was very fond of the good life. He wanted to be a knight when he was a young guy. But in his probably late teens or very early 20s, he had an epiphany, and that changed his whole life. And from then on, he was focused on the poor, and he was very committed to pacifism, to ending wars, and to ecology. And we'll talk more about all those things. The actual occasion of the big change in his life was when one day, praying in front of a crucifix, it spoke to him and said, "Repair my church." And he saw that as God talking directly to him and calling on him to live the life that he went on to live. So thereafter, he lived a life of prayer, almsgiving, sometimes being a hermit, and we'll talk a lot more about that life and what he achieved. He died in 1226, and he's probably, or certainly, you know, there'd be a good case for arguing that he's the best known saint in the world today. And I thought we might start off by talking about why he has such an extraordinary legacy, why he's so well known. Alban, why is he such a giant of a figure?
Well, I mean, I think it's worth saying that he's not only the most attractive and best known of all the saints, but even in his own lifetime, he was one of the most challenging, controversial, and to a certain extent enigmatic. But I think there's first of all a very understandable fascination with the personality, this enigmatic, impetuous personality. And unlike many other saints, a lot of what's been written, and more has been written about St. Francis perhaps than any other saint, a great deal of it is concerned with an attempt to understand and an interest in his personality. I think it's important to say also that but there's such an obviousness and immediacy about what motivated the life that he did come to lead. He's been hijacked by many, many different causes that sometimes skirt round the real issue, the real focus of his life. St Francis fell in love with God. He spoke about lady poverty. His overwhelming sense of the goodness and beauty of God and his creation is so apparent and so immediate. I think also that there's a remarkable and perhaps even unique consistency between his life and his words, rare in any human being. And I think also there is a sense in which one of the key central insights of his own life lived out throughout, a sense in which this insight is so, undeniably true. The whole of his attachment to a life of poverty is, I think, rooted in his seeing through the illusion of ownership. It's not that he despises things. He loves the created world because he loves its creator. He doesn't despise people who own this, that, and the other. He didn't want anything of his own because he saw through the illusion of ownership. And if you think of it, it is an absolutely, we don't own our own lives. How can we own anything? But at the center of all of this is this passionate love of God and his absolutely, palpable love for the person of Christ. However much you convert him and his personality and his life into, as it were, support for this or that cause, that's the core, and everything else flows from that.
He sort of I guess he was very good at sort of nailing the basics that are the perennial basics of Christianity, wasn't he? He sort of we can see even through all these centuries that the things he cared about are the things that are the basics of Christianity always.
Well, it's the gospel life. He's in the rule, the first chapter of the rule, he says, the rule and life of the Friars Minor is this, to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And when he goes to Pope Innocent III in 1209, thereabouts, to seek approval, because he's extremely anxious not to be thought of as heretical. Again, another aspect people often get wrong, he was not against the institutional church. On the contrary, he goes on and on and on and on about loyalty to the papacy, to the church, the Catholic Church, in the first and the last chapter of the rule, etc. But when he goes for approval, all he takes as the rule is a set of quotations from the New Testament. The actual rules, the early one and the later one, they come much later. And so we've lost that collection of texts. We have lost a lot of his writings, I mean, we've only got a very small portion of them. But he goes in order for approval. His life is, it's been said many times by many others, if anybody imitated Christ, it was St. Francis. He wanted nothing other than to live the same life that our Lord had lived, and that's shown to us in the Gospels. There's
I think he was even
about it, and a simplicity that just can't not appeal to you.
I think he was even spoken of as a second. I mean, as kind of a second.
Yes.
Gabriele, why? What has led to this exhibition that you're opening next week? Why now for this show? Why is it a Francis moment for the National Gallery?
There are several reasons. One is I was very struck one day walking through the Sainsbury wing, which is where the gallery's early pictures are, sort of medieval, mostly Italian, but some pictures from Northern Europe as well. And I was just struck how frequently you come across St. Francis in these paintings, whether he appears in a landscape receiving the stigmata, or whether he's in the presence of the Virgin and Child in a Sacra Conversazione type picture. So his presence is very marked in the early part of our collection, but not just in the early part of the collection. If you look later in the gallery, you'll find that he's represented in the 17th century by Zurbarán and other artists. In the 18th century, not at the National Gallery, but Tiepolo takes him up, and of course you come into the 19th and 20th centuries, and he's pretty ubiquitous, which means that he's a very, very strong presence in the Western tradition of image making, and that's a very good reason to do an exhibition. But I think the story of the image making of St. Francis is also the story about the different ways in which St. Francis has been perceived. And what's so interesting is at different times he's been perceived as a slightly different personality, or different aspects of his personality, let's put it that way, are brought to the fore. And Alban mentioned before how Francis has been sort of taken up for lots of different causes and so on. And I think the imagery over time also reflects that. So he's an absolutely fascinating personality as a protagonist of the history of art. It's also interesting, I think, that when you think of Assisi itself, and in particular the Sacro Convento, the place where St. Francis is buried, where the Giotto frescoes are, you have this bringing together of an extraordinary group of artists. You have Cimabue, you have Giotto, you have Simone Martini, you have the Lorenzetti brothers. Around 1300, something extraordinary is happening in Italian art, which has a huge impact on art throughout Europe, and it's all connected with Francis and the early Franciscans.
So indeed, it's Francis was. In the case of some saints, it's a bit after their death, isn't it, that they're sort of taken up and taken to sainthood. But Francis was canonized, I think I'm right in saying, Alban, is very soon after his death, and was very quickly. How many?
2 years after. 2
years after.
Yeah.
And that must be a big part of why he's so well known today, and why he's the figure he is, because he was so quickly sort of injected into
well, I think it's the other way around. He was canonized so quickly because he was the kind of
person he was.
Fascinating, interesting, impressive, undeniably on the ball saint.
And what Gabriele is saying, which is very interesting, I think, is that because this extraordinary man coincided with this extraordinary moment in art, he was taken up, and almost, am I right, Gabriele, almost the one thing, or both of you, maybe the one thing helped the other. So the development of the art helped the development of the knowledge of Francis, and vice versa.
So, the order grows very, very quickly, even in Francis's own lifetime. It's astonishing to view how what begins as a small brotherhood of essentially just a few friends of Francis in Assisi, very, very rapidly grows to a large organization, slightly sort of beyond Francis's control at a certain point, but grows very rapidly. And Francis very, very quickly is sending friars to evangelize throughout Europe, and indeed to North Africa. He himself goes to Egypt in 1219, and then on to the Holy Land. So the order grows very rapidly, and it spreads very rapidly. And I think Francis and the early Franciscans are very aware of how valuable image making is to their calling to evangelize. So image making, particularly of Francis, sort of promotes the cult of Francis, of course, but also it serves to recount the stories. It serves to support the preaching, and the Franciscans are a preaching order right from the start.
And I think, Alban, that this is right, that he was actually, although he is the founder of, would it numerically be the biggest Catholic religious order, the Franciscans? Certainly one of the bigger ones.
Yes, I think the Jesuits used to be bigger. There are no large religious orders now, but in their heyday, I think the Jesuits were larger.
Right.
Put all three branches of the Franciscans together, it came almost to the extent of the Jesuits. But Gabriele is totally right. This astonishing rapidity with which it grew is almost unbelievable. I mean,
sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, even in an age like our own, with such instantaneous communication, it would be a remarkable phenomenon.
Yeah.
But you know, 2 years before he himself died, he sent friars here, for instance. They came in 1224, and it grew here in England. Gosh, amazing. They arrived in September 1224, and by 1226 they were in Oxford, Cambridge, Salisbury, Winchester. They, you know, all over the place, thousands.
And there's a kind of irony here, isn't there? Because you were telling me before, and maybe you'd say a bit more about this now, that he was actually a reluctant founder. It wasn't what he set out to do, to found a religious order. Absolutely,
he did not. That simply wasn't his, what do they say these days, playbook. Yeah, but because remember, he says in the Testament towards the end of his life, this is the great document that where he sort of states how it all happened. He says, the Lord gave me brethren. And so two came and joined him. He had not the slightest intention to found an order. And it's only when it began to resemble an order that he then is anxious to get approval. But no sooner has it begun to grow, and he already feels uncomfortable, already finds it difficult to, he wasn't an organizer, even completely the opposite. He was an absolute, you know, administration was not his forte. And eventually, of course, he hands over. But he's already disappointed by the time he comes back from Egypt. People have begun to build houses, and they've begun to gather property, and he just completely disillusioned, disappointed, and feels that his ideals are being traduced. I think it's worth saying, though, that, you know, his ideals are very difficult to bottle. I mean, I think the idea of institutionalizing them was probably a no-starter from the beginning. And I think even the heyday of the order is a very short heyday. Then it becomes very heavily institutionalized, although it still makes, you know, a great contribution in many, many different ways, right through its whole life. Mozart's favorite teacher was a Franciscan, you know, people like that. But anyway, so the order becomes a creature quite separate from the founder. But I mean, the most faithful follower is St Clare, and her order, and again, hers has to be an order because women couldn't be just, you know, doing what the friars did. But she's the one who holds on to the ideals, and she fights tooth and nail even against various popes who, out of solicitude for her and the poor ladies of Assisi, tried to get them to have property, for an endowment. She gets a dispensation from ever having to own property.
I must admit, I did feel slightly when we were in Assisi, and I was lucky enough to go along with Gabriele and a team of journalists and other staff from the National Gallery to Assisi to see some of the art that's coming to the National Gallery in situ before it travels. And it did strike me, I don't know if you agree, Gabriele or Alban, that St Clare maybe has possibly not been given her, you know, quite her full kind of due in the church, because certainly in Assisi, Francis is the overwhelming character of the town. And in fact, St Clare, I think I'm right in saying, outlived Francis considerably, and presumably as they were so close, and then as Alban says, she carried on really his tradition. You know, she was, I imagine, also very important to the continuation of the truths that they both held so dear.
Yes.
One of the reasons why Francis is so successful in art, let's say, is that there are, you know, from a very early date, the narratives of St Francis are being widely diffused by the Franciscans themselves, and of course in the early biographies. He's fantastically well served by early biographies. He's always on the move. There are miracles happening around him the whole time. So there's lots to represent in the story of Francis, and you know, everybody knows about Francis preaching to the birds and the Wolf of Gubbio, but there are dozens and dozens of anecdotes which are recounted in the early lives, which are recounted in the Little Flowers, And so these are the raw material for image making. If you're St Clair and you're enclosed in a convent, there's less narrative to represent. And the imagery of Francis was very, very widespread from an early date. So, you know, we've even got an image of Francis which probably dates from just between his death in 1226 and his canonization in 1228. So it's not a portrait made while he's alive, but very, very soon after. And we know that because the inscription on this fresco in the Sacro Specchio says Frate Francisco, rather than Saint Francis. So it must have been made just before he was canonized. But from that point on, images are made almost on an industrial scale of St. Francis. So he appears in altarpieces, he appears in frescoes, he appears in small devotional pictures, and something of that, of course, is what we want to represent in the exhibition. So we've tried to bring together some of those very compelling early images, where often he stands like a Byzantine saint with his hand raised in blessing, usually holding the gospel open at one of those verses from the Sermon on the Mount, which inspired him to take up his life of conversion. And then flanking this central images are scenes from his life, his miracles, some of them posthumous, but also you know, his encounter with the Pope, the stigmatization on Mount Laverna. So there's a whole set of stories appearing around the saint from a very, very early date.
Mm-hmm.
So he was kind of, a lot of what happened to him in his life is kind of made for visual interpretation, you could say. Alban, how does Francis's character, I mean, I would ask this, I'd be interested in this if I was talking to a Benedictine or a Jesuit, I'd be interested in this as well, but we're talking about Francis and you're a Franciscan. How does Francis's character, how does it you know, mesh into your life? In your I know you're not in a big community, are you, because of the work you do as an academic? But how does Francis's life example touch the lives of a Franciscan like you today?
Embarrassingly. I, you know, he is as inimitable. I mean, he simply is one off. You know, I mean, it's. I'm not sure how I'd answer that question except to say this man is absolutely inimitable. He's eccentric. Remember, people quite understandably thought he was completely balmy, completely mad. And in a certain sense, he would have admitted to that. He called himself a you know, a fool of Christ.
And I guess that's very similar to, we could argue, to being a Christian, isn't it? Because we're all following somebody who it's impossible to be.
Yeah.
As Christians.
And remember, you know, the one very good historical indication of how difficult it was, if not impossible, to reproduce or replicate his life is the fact that from even within his lifetime, you have massive and often heated disagreement and divergence about the way of life. And that's how, from the very beginning, and remember, you've got all kinds of developments in the order, and the order eventually splits. I mean, it's in 3 now, but until the end of the 19th century, there were about 30 different divisions. A whole pile of them were brought together by Leo XIII and the Leonine Union, and I think 1890, something like that. So that then you have just 3. But even in his lifetime, there was huge disputes when Brother Elias, whom he handed the order over to, began to build the Basilica and the Sacro Convento. Lots of people became disaffected then. Some of them ended up officially, the spirituals, so-called spirituals, the Fraticelli, became heretics or were condemned as heretics. And so the division all the way through about how to interpret his life and how to replicate his life.
I guess that's another thing about him that maybe it makes him, I hadn't really understood this until I was in Assisi on this kind of art pilgrimage and part religious pilgrimage, I think also it was, wasn't it? But, you know, it was a messy life. and he didn't strike me, I don't know if you'd agree, but he didn't strike me as somebody who was kind of particularly easy to get on with. He had quite a lot of battles and fights with people and fallouts, starting of course with his own father, but continuing into other people in the order. And it seemed very, he's not, it struck me anyway, he's not some kind of perfect guy saint, although of course he lived this extraordinary life, that, as Alban's saying, but his life was messy. Do you agree, Gabriele?
Yeah, we know a lot about St. Francis. We'd like to know a lot more, of course, but we know a lot about it because of these early accounts and these early documents, some of which are documents of Francis himself. I mean, Alban mentioned the Testament, which is such an important document to try and understand how Francis perceived his own life and his own calling. One of the things that's very remarkable, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, Francis was referred to very early on as alter Christus, as another Christ. This was felt by some people to be practically blasphemous. That Francis should be described as a second Christ or another Christ. But there was this sense, and I think throughout history since then, there has been this sense that somehow in Francis was incarnated the Spirit of Christ in a way that it hasn't been in anyone else since, or up to that point. And that total conformity to Christ, which is the sort of technical phrase that's often used about Francis, became manifest in his own body in this extraordinary event of the stigmatization on Mount Laverna towards the end of his life, where he, as he's in prayer at night on Mount Laverna, because Francis also had this inclination towards the heremitic life. He wanted to be alone to pray in wild places in the middle of nature, to be close to God and to have a very intense personal relationship with God. Anyway, during the night in Mount Laverna in 1224, something extraordinary happens where the wounds of Christ are visited on his own body. And so that's total conformity to Christ, his own desire to live as Christ did, his own desire for martyrdom, actually. Francis had a desire to be martyred. And somehow this experience of the stigmatization was the way in which the sort of passion of Christ was visited on his own body. That's an absolute gift for artists, you can imagine, something so extraordinary, so physical, so real and visible, is what artists absolutely love to represent. And of course, it's one of the key moments in the artist's life. And there are two moments, I'd say, that are constantly represented over the course of subsequent history. One is the moment of the stigmatization, which is, the sort of divine sanction of Francis's calling and of his own sanctity. And the other, of course, is his preaching to the birds. So the direct connection with God, direct connection with Christ, and then this connection with the natural world.
And shall we? And we have actually some of those, just a tiny kind of sample of some of the paintings that you've got coming to the National Gallery. Amanda, could we maybe have a look at a couple of those, because they are exactly of those moments in Francis's life. The number 2 and 3, Amanda, and maybe Gabriele would tell us a bit more about.
So yes, maybe if we go to this one.
Yeah.
This is by a Sienese 15th century artist called Sassetta, and it comes from an altarpiece in which St. Francis is the main figure. And this is one of the smaller panels which recount episodes from his life. We have 7 out of 8 of the panels which made up this altarpiece, which has now been dismantled. But this is the moment that I was referring to. He's on Mount Laverna. Brother Leo, one of his close followers, is sitting there to the right, and you can see he's raised his hands, and there's this apparition in the heavens of a seraphic Christ, so a sort of mixture of an angel and a man on a cross, or taking up the position of the crucified Christ, and then the rays leading down from the wounds of Christ onto Francis's own body. So this sort of imprinting of the stigmata on Francis's body, and we're seeing this as it happens, and it's this moment where Francis is sort of divinized by this extraordinary encounter. Francis was very, very self-conscious, as you can imagine, about this event, and there was a lot of discussion of what it meant, and exactly what form it took, and exactly what the stigmata looked like. There were slightly different accounts of all of this, but it is a crucial moment in the life of Francis, of course, but also in terms of the imagery of Francis, which has come down to us. That sort of very direct encounter between Francis and Christ himself.
Mm.
Shall we move on to? Yes.
So this is El Greco. This is about a century and a half later, and one of the things that we try and show in the exhibition is that you get a different emphasis at different times. So El Greco is working towards the end of the 16th century, the very beginning of the 17th century. El Greco is an artist born in Crete, but then spends time in Venice and Rome, and eventually ends up in Spain. And his image of Francis is a very different sort of saint that you see in early Renaissance pictures, or indeed in the gold ground pictures of the 14th century. He's an ascetic Francis. He's a visionary Francis. You have no real sense of location, for example, in this picture, even though it's exactly the same subject as we've seen in the Sacetta, and you can just make out on the top left-hand corner, he's seeing this apparition, this vision of the seraph, or the crucified Christ. But you can see we've entered into the mystical experience of Francis. So Francis becomes a mystic in the hands of El Greco. It's a different sort of Francis. It's an image of Francis which corresponds more, as it were, to the needs of the time than the sort of rather more straightforward narrative rendition that we see in Sacetta. And one of the things that the exhibition tries to do is to examine how, over the course of history, artists are responding to different aspects of the life of Francis, or different emphasis is being pulled out of the life and experiences of Francis.
Mm.
So if we move on to there's the last of these images we've got. I mean, this is a 20th century artist, isn't it, Gabriele? And what are we seeing here?
Well, this is the wonderful Stanley Spencer, and he's painting, of course, here in Britain in the 1930s. This is an image from the 1930s, and it's a very sort of quirky version of Francis and the birds. He's sort of Francis in a farmyard. It's actually a sort of portrait of his father dressed in his dressing gown, but he's transformed him into Francis. And there is in Spencer, there's often this sort of tremendous joy of being with the family, of being with nature, and I think Spencer responded both to the joy of Francis and indeed to the poverty of Francis. And I think English artists in the sort of 1930s, I think between the war, when there was an experience of a lot of poverty, I think Francis takes on a sort of protagonist role in the work of quite a lot of British artists.
I like the slippers there, if they are slippers.
They are indeed, and that's the dressing gown, which doubles up as Francis's habit.
And this painting having a Spencer also makes the point for us that he has continued to be an inspiration to artists. And indeed, I think you've even got a commission, have you not, Gabriele, as part of this exhibition, a new commission?
It's been very good to work with some contemporary artists as well. We have a work by Anthony Gormley, who one of his very early sculptures, one of these body cast sculptures that he did, was devoted to Francis. And we've commissioned a work from Richard Long, the land artist. Richard Long has worked with landscape, with rocks, and I felt that Richard Long would respond very well to this idea of Francis being close to the earth, of sort of crisscrossing the landscape. Francis was always on the move, preaching in Umbria, in Lazio, in Tuscany, and so on. And you get the sensation that he's always moving around the landscape. And of course, when he comes to the end of his life, he asks to be laid out on the naked earth And I thought, well, who better than Richard Long to have a go at this? So Richard Long's done something for us. It'll be a surprise when you see it.
We look forward to that. And that obviously, as I say, makes the point that, you know, the messages of Francis, the things he's got to say to our world are as great today as they were in his own time. And that's only been amplified, has it not, Alban, by the fact that our current Pope chose to take the name of Francis. I think the first Pope who's ever done that, is he? And I wondered why did Cardinal Bergoglio, as he was before he became Pope, why did he choose the name of Francis? What does it say about the papacy and about the world today that he did that?
Well, I heard a story, perhaps you did too, that when the fateful moment in the conclave came and the canopy remained above his head and all the others came down, indicating that he'd been elected, the cardinal next to him, the South American cardinal, I think, I've forgotten his name now, begins with an H, apparently whispered to him, "Remember the poor." And Francis, I think I'm right in recounting this, Francis himself said that was why he chose the name Francis. But a lot of people would say, gosh, you know, who on earth would choose the name Francis with that kind of implied desire to imitate him? But that's the reason, to remember the poor.
And I think people also have linked Francis to the Pope Francis, I mean, to St Francis's interest in ecology, love of nature, one of the most important documents, and indeed I think many people feel that the lasting legacy of Francis's pontificate will be his document Laudato Si and the work he's done for the environment.
Yes, I think, yeah, we need to be careful not to convert it into, you know, kind of environmentalists' manifesto. But the Laudato Si, of course, are the first words of the Canticle of the Sun, rather some. I think, you know, the essence of that document, that encyclical, sorry, it's about the integrity of creation. And that's not just the natural world, but the whole created environment, including ourselves. I think it would be wrong to think of it as just, you know, a kind of David Attenborough, souped up David Attenborough. It's about the integrity of creation, God's creation, and our inclusion in it. And, you know, that great Benedictine theme comes through in it, that, you know, that we are stewards, we're not owners. We're stewards, we're not here to exploit it. We're here to live in it and derive from it and contribute to it and rejoice in it, and also to praise God for it.
Thanks, Alban. Amanda, I know it's getting some questions in from people who have joined us. I actually can't see those questions. So Amanda, would you either pop a couple, just the beginning of them came up for me. So I could see them on email if you emailed them to me, or you throw us a few, if Gabriele and Alban are happy to answer some questions from the audience.
So the first question is from Michael Woodward, and he says the Dominicans had Father Anglico. Did the early Franciscans have a similar artist who was a member of the order? Interesting.
Well, Fra Angelico.
Oh, sorry. Fra Angelico.
Gabriele, this is for you, really.
There've been several Franciscan artists in history. If you think of you know, Bernardo Strozzi, who was a Capuchin friar in Genoa and then moved to Venice, but there's certainly many artists who even today are members of the Third Order. So the tradition of image making and artistry associated with Francis and the Franciscan Order goes back a long time.
I don't know whether it counts as art, but one of the great cartographers that moved cartography on to where we are now was Vincenzo Coronelli, who was the cartographer of the Venetian Republic, who was an encyclopedist, really. He was the provincial of the province, and had the idea of putting together this, encyclopedia to counter the Encyclopedia of the Philosophe, but he was the great cartographer.
Thank you. Thanks very much for.
And also,
that.
could just to mention, as I mentioned before, the artistry of another kind, that the greatest musicologist of 18th century Europe, Mozart's favorite teacher, was a Franciscan, Giambattista Martini from Bologna.
Yeah. Another question we've got in is someone's asking for Gabriele, will the National Gallery exhibition be sent to America at any point? I'm guessing our questioner there is in America, Dave. Gabriele, do you have plans for this show to travel anywhere else, even in the future?
No, the show will only happen at the National Gallery, but I'm told by colleagues in Assisi, and the mayor of Assisi was telling me that there are centenary celebrations coming up, and there's plans for a big Francis show to happen in Assisi in the next few years. But I think you'll find that Francis often features in exhibitions, and it's not so uncommon to find exhibitions devoted exclusively to Francis. I think this is the first major exhibition in this country, and certainly the first we've devoted to him at the National Gallery. But it is just happening here in London.
And I guess, as you said at the top, Gabriele, any visitor to the National Gallery any day of the week when there isn't the show on will actually find an awful lot of images of St Francis, paintings of St Francis around the Sainsbury wing and elsewhere in the gallery. Because
that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
And maybe it would also be a good moment to just put in a bit of a plug, if people will allow us to do that, for the tablet pilgrimage, which is heading to Italy with Alban at the helm in September. On our National Gallery trip to look at the art, we went to many of the places where I think, it's so difficult to separate, isn't it, a pilgrimage that's about the faith components and a pilgrimage that's about the art, because they're so closely intertwined. But Alban, you'll presumably, so the point I make is that a visit to Assisi and that area of Italy, is going to give you a lot of insights into the art as well as the story.
Yes, well, it is Rome and Assisi.
Yeah.
4 days in Rome, 4 days in Assisi. Yeah. And I hope we can get into the Sacred Convento, into the innards of it, that are not normally seen by tourists, into the great papal apartments and the various cloisters, and the magnificent porticato and the refectory, and the place.
And of course, there's so much to see, and I know Gabriele feels very strongly about this. That the art in the lower church, isn't it, Gabriele, of the Giottos? I mean, that really brings together these two strands of faith and art, because I think you would say, would you not, that that's really the driving force, the beginning of the Renaissance. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I'd say that while Francis is a sort of universal saint and is important for everyone all over the world, nonetheless, to go to the places of Francis is a very special experience. I mean, I often think if Francis had been born in South London, where I live, he may not have turned out to be the Francis that emerged from Umbria in the 12th century. There is something about the spirit of the place, and Assisi is a remarkably beautiful town with this great hill above it, Mount Subasio, the sacred convent, the Sacro Convento, sort of on the spur at the end of the town, the valley stretching out in front of you, Perugia just a short distance away, the places associated with Francis, Greccio, where the first crib was made, Gubbio, where he encountered the wolf, Laverna, which is in the province of Arezzo. I mean, these are remarkably beautiful natural settings, and places where the architecture and these medieval towns fit in so naturally with the landscape. And there is something very, very special about that. The kind of bird song that you hear there, the bells ringing across the valley. I mean, these are, there is something very special about encountering Francis in those places.
You kind of feel, don't you, that you're seeing, obviously you're seeing the landscape Francis knew, and I think that is an element of that area of Italy that we don't know, do we, how it looked in these days, but there are reasons to think more than in other places on earth that it's maybe similar to what Francis saw. I felt that particularly in La Verna, the hillside where he lived as a hermit. We've got another question here, which is quite interesting, from somebody asking, I guess for you, Alban, why didn't Francis want to be ordained a priest? I know he was ordained a deacon, but why not a priest?
I don't think anybody knows. There's no documentary references to any motivation or absence of motivation. I don't know. I don't think anybody else does know either.
Our question is wondering whether it's because he wanted to be alone in prayer, a hermit, and to be a kind of individual rather than connected to the.
Well, no, because I mean, I don't think that would be it. I think it's being a deacon was a public role, a sacramental role. It's part of the sacrament of orders. I think what the point Gabriele made before we started might be the nearest thing to the reasonably be assumed, that he felt. It was humility, he felt somehow, I don't know, that this would be too exalted, because he had this huge respect for the priesthood, quite remarkable. And, given that perhaps even more than now, there was lots of shadows hovering over it.
There's another question here from Richard, who asks, would it be fair to say that there is less imagery of St. Francis the peacemaker than there is of St. Francis the mystic or contemplative close to nature? And is this a gap in the representation of Francis's spirituality? Gabriele? Yeah,
I guess not all aspects of Francis' life are susceptible to image making, and many aspects weren't treated in the imagery. One of the aspects which is terribly important is the encounter with the Sultan in Egypt. So Francis accompanies one of the Crusades to North Africa. His intention seems to have been twofold. One is to be able to preach the love of Christ to Muslims, but also, he had this deep-seated desire to offer his life for Christ. So he goes to Damietta in Egypt, and he manages to sort of get through the enemy lines, and is taken into the presence of the Sultan, and he has an encounter which, by any measurement, by any measure, was very extraordinary, because it was a highly respectful encounter, where there was a mutual sort of appreciation of the faith of the other. Francis was keen to demonstrate his faith in God, and offered to take a challenge, and offered to walk through flames to say, this is how my God is. But it was very clear that this encounter was not hostile. It was very respectful, and the Sultan gave him gifts on his departure. Now he refused those. He refused money, but in the Sacro Convento in Assisi is preserved an ivory horn, which seems to be the only surviving physical element from that remarkable encounter between the leader of the Muslims in Egypt and Francis himself. And the Franciscans at the Sacro Convento have allowed us to borrow it. So this ivory horn, which stands really as a symbol of friendship between Sultan al-Malik and Francis, I think is one of the things that, again, makes Francis so attractive to us. Sort of outside of his time, he's able to have a respectful encounter with somebody from a different religion. And that's one of the reasons why Francis has also been taken up as a sort of patron of the dialogue between religions, particularly by St John Paul II some years ago. And those sort of great faith encounters that take place in Assisi take place sort of under the, let's say, the spiritual protection of St Francis.
Alban, do you feel that there are elements of Francis's personality? Maybe we've been talking about the art, or that question was about the art, but do you feel there are elements of Francis's personality that have been, buried more, that we need to know more about? Do you think there are elements of him that are brought? I think Gabriele was saying, in the art anyway, different periods of history, one element of him has been emphasized. But what do you think? What's the element for you that we're missing, or that we know most about? What are the most important elements of his character?
Gosh, one of the early sources says, I think somewhere, I can't remember once hearing that people were mesmerized by his words, that his words were not only burning and penetrating but soothing. I think is it Jacques de Vitry on the way to the Holy Land reported hearing him preach, and when he was asked what he said in his sermon, he said, I can't remember a word, but it's changed my life. So his charisma was very immediate and very I think one of these rare individuals where there's nothing between him and you. Do you know an immediacy? Now, I suppose you want to ask oneself, how do you imagine him? I think also his relationship to St Clare is very, very, very important and not made enough of. I mean, it was to her that he went when he was trying to decide whether to be contemplative or active. They took his body straight away up to her when he died. She embodied his ideals to perfection, and I think the relationship between them was a magnificent example of Christian friendship, and I think certainly the early brethren were in no doubt how they were a mutual inspiration to each other.
And there's something very modern, isn't there, about the fact that, I mean, a lot of the church's history has been very male, but actually St Francis has always been allied, but with a female character. So there's always been these two in concert, which feels, to me anyway, a more, quite a modern.
Well, behind every great man, and it even applies to ecclesiastical figures. Look at St Francis de Sales. Look at John Paul II, we now know. Look at Karl Rahner. Look at Herbert Vaughan. I'm just thinking of random names. St Francis and St Clare might not have been that unusual in one sense, but I think we
could say the other way around, couldn't we? That St Clare couldn't have been who she was without Francis, and vice versa. So
no, well, there was a 12-year age gap between them.
Yeah,
and she came from a completely different class. I mean, she was on the other side in terms of the class war that was going on at the time, and she took a great risk, and he took an even greater risk, cutting her hair off and giving her the veil, as it were. He could have been put to the sword by any of her relatives very easily, and they did try to wrest her from his company. It was very, I mean, so he was innovative and daring, and not exactly of his time.
He certainly wasn't somebody who was trying to fit in, was he? I mean, he was doing the thing that he felt was right, but he wasn't looking for to do what everyone else was doing. Gabriele, it's unusual, or maybe not so unusual, but I think it is a bit unusual in this day and age to have a show that's kind of devotional, spiritual in nature. And I know that this show is, for you, it's not just art, it is art with spiritual meaning. I just wondered what some people might think that the time for devotional art is in the past, and what art is about these days is, post-Christian, just that we don't link it anymore except in history. Is your feeling on that?
So the first thing I'd say is that the National Gallery has about 1/3 of its collection, which is Christian art. So it's perfectly relevant that we should do an exhibition of this kind. We have experience here in this museum, since the year 2000. Some of the listeners may remember an exhibition we did called Seeing Salvation, the Image of Christ. And then subsequent exhibitions, which really didn't soft pedal the religious aspect of the art that we were exhibiting. And I think it's become perfectly kind of legitimate and serious to try and understand the devotional aspect of the art that we're showing. This is fundamentally an art exhibition. It's an exhibition about the representation of Francis, about the different ways in which the artist has been represented over time, the different aspects of Francis that artists have wanted to represent. But it's also about, Francis's own beliefs. It's about why Francis is still important to so many people, about his significance as a faith figure. We don't feel that there's any reason at all to reduce the importance of that. It is extremely important. You can't separate that in a way from the art. And so the story of the exhibition is a story of 8 centuries of image making and artists making images of Francis, but it's also about what Francis means, about what his faith was about how he has influenced people's belief over all that period.
I think we've just got time. Thanks so much, Gabriele. I think we've just got time maybe for one last very quick question. I've got a very quick question, which is partly linked to something that one of our audience has asked, and that is, could each of you recommend, for people who've very kindly joined us today, might be interested in reading more about St Francis, a good art book, Gabriele, on art that connects to St Francis, and Alban, a good book that allows us more, helps us to understand the spirituality and the man himself. Who'd like to? Alban.
I go first. Do you know what I would recommend? G.K. Chesterton.
Which one? What?
Just St Francis of Assisi. He wrote it in the 20s.
Okay.
It's superb. He wrote one on Aquinas in exactly the same way. He catches it completely. Or catches him completely, I mean.
Thank you.
Well, I'd recommend André Vaucher, who's a French historian and a specialist on Francis. He published a biography not so many years ago, which is, I think, immensely well researched, very revealing about the significance of Francis for his own time, but also explores how Francis's personality and image has been shaped by events and by trends and by great movements in subsequent periods. So he wants very much to understand Francis in his own time, but also is very interested in the way Francis has been presented over time, right up to our own age. That's André Vaucher. I'm very happy to say he's also participated in the publication that we've produced for the exhibition. So if you'll allow me, that's the book that I'd also recommend.
Thank you very much, and can I just quickly say thank you to both of you, Gabriele Finaldi, the director of the National Gallery, and Father Alban McCoy. Thank you very, very much for joining us, and I'm so pleased that we were able to do this webinar, because I was very struck on this trip we made to Assisi, the National Gallery trip, by the relevance of Francis, and the art is magnificent. The art we saw is extraordinary, and I really recommend the exhibition, which Amanda's going to tell us, going to just sign off by telling us the dates of that. And then also, if you're interested in going to Assisi, consider the tablet pilgrimage later this year. Amanda.
Well, thanks very much, Joanna, and thanks so much to Alban and to Gabriele. Yes, if there's a book that we'd like to recommend, it's the catalogue of the exhibition, of course. So if you do go to the exhibition, I can tell you a little bit more about it. So it's free to attend at the National Gallery. It's called the St Francis of Assisi exhibition, and it runs from the 6th of May until the 30th of July 2023. So I've had lots of people on the call saying that they're interested to go, so all the details are there, and I'm sure we'll run the details as well in the tablet for you. If you are interested in a little bit more Francis of Assisi, we did run another webinar which was done through Sarum College, and it was about what does Francis of Assisi have to say to theology today. And we did record that particular webinar, so if you're interested, just send me an email and I'll send that recording on to you free of charge. Other things coming up with the tablet, are Catholics coming back to Mass? Well, that's the question the Pastoral Review team will be asking on the 26th of April. So book your tickets for that. And we're in the last of our series of a tablet reflection programme focusing on the spirituality of Catholic religious orders. So we've got Eastern Orthodox Spirituality on the 4th of May, hosted by Sister Thea Kitsi. Faith in the public square, that's a question that will come around to us on Tuesday the 9th, and that follows the coronation. So that's in association with Notre Dame University. And we're still looking at the synod. So for a synodal church, communion, participation, mission, where are the synodal discussions leading the Catholic Church? Well, Christopher Lamb might have the answer for that one for you. Our pilgrimages continue. We have the pilgrimage to the Holy Land of Patmos. But I think the one you'll be interested in this evening is the Roman Assisi with the tablet. So you can join Father Alban McCoy as he takes you on a trip of Roman Assisi. He'll be your spiritual lead for that trip. And it's the 11th to the 19th of September. There are still room to book on that one. We've also got our trip to Turkey with McCabe, and that's departing on the 13th to the 26th of September. And you'll be led by our expert in all things Turkey, Dr. Natalie K. Watson, our theologian and editor that works on the Pastoral Review. And we've also got our Holy Land and Jordan trip. Plenty of trips there for you coming up with the tablet. Subscribe to the Pastoral Review and the tablet. If you're not a subscriber, you can find all the details on how to subscribe at www.thetablet.co.uk. And please remember, the tablet is a registered charity. And if you'd like to donate to this year's tablet fundraising campaign, then please go to the website under Development Fund. It just leaves me to say thank you again to all of our speakers. It's been a most enjoyable evening, a most enjoyable webinar. There's a lot of work goes into these webinars, so thank you for your time and your expertise.
Can I say something, Amanda? Can I just, Tricia Carr, can I just say something?
Absolutely, Tricia. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Gabriele, for doing this exhibition, because the world pretends it doesn't believe in anything, but it does. And St. Francis is universal and absolutely wonderful. So thank you for having the courage to do it. And dear Father Alban, well done. And Amanda, thank you so much. And Joanna, you're wonderful. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you.
Don't apologise. We take all of the gratitude. Thank you very much. On behalf of all of us, the tablet team that work behind the scenes on this webinar, and our very gracious speakers, we all wish you a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye-bye.